Hello again. I have, of course, spoken before about what happens when science is at the mercy of ideology. In Soviet Russia at one time, the crackpot theories of Lysenko were officially adopted because they conformed to the idea of Marxist-Leninism. This meant rejecting the very idea of genes as the mode for inheriting characteristics. In Nazi Germany, Einstein's theory of relativity was regarded as Jewish science and therefore not suited to the Aryans. In both cases, the consequences of allowing science to be controlled by ideology were dreadful. You might think that with such examples from the past to warn us, we would in the modern world be very careful not to let the same thing occur again. That scientists would be sure not to let politics interfere with their work, or cloud their judgment, or confuse their conclusions. Unfortunately, we have not learned from the past, and today in the Western world something very similar is happening with the ideology of anti-racism. This is acting to prevent the study of anthropology and paleoarchaeology, to give but two instances. Let me explain what I mean. For a long time, certainly since the 1950s and 60s, it has been known that something truly extraordinary happened about 50,000 years ago. Before that time, human populations, both our own species, Homo sapiens, and earlier types of humans, such as Homo erectus, went on for hundreds of thousands of years without any significant developments or changes in their way of life. Homo erectus produced the same kind of stone tools for over 1 million years without making any progress. Even Homo sapiens was seemingly stuck in some kind of bottleneck, using the same technology and following the same way of life for 200,000 or 300,000 years. Then, about 50,000 years ago, everything suddenly changed with great rapidity. Humans began making fish hooks and boomerangs, painting realistic pictures on the walls of caves, sculpting miniature figurines, producing needles so they could sew clothes, conducting ceremonial funerals, trading goods, and engaging in symbolic thought. All this happening suddenly after more than 250,000 of years of stagnation, and of course it led ultimately to civilization. Paleoarchaeologists describe this as the Great Leap Forward, and it was something of a mystery which seemed quite insoluble. It just had to be accepted that this incredibly rapid progress, which signalled the arrival of humans who thought like us, just took place at that time, and that was all there was to it. It was hypothesized that this sudden apparent change in the functioning of human brains might be associated with some genetic change, but what that might be was anybody's guess. Until relatively recently, it was firmly believed that modern humans and Neanderthals never mated, and that no Neanderthal genes are to be found in our DNA. Here is Steve Jones in this book, Popular Science, published 30 years ago. Just let me quote a little bit here. He's talking about the Neanderthals, of course. If there had been extensive mating between the indigenous population and the invaders, then modern Europeans would be expected to retain genes from this distinct branch of the human family and be genetically different from, say, today's Chinese or Indians, whose ancestors never met a Neanderthal, let alone mated with one. They are not. In other words, in 1993, it was firmly believed that humans and Neanderthals didn't mix, that there was no genetic inheritance from the Neanderthals in Europe and Asia. In the last couple of decades, though, we've found that this is completely wrong, and that Neanderthals and modern humans did interbreed, and that another archaic human species was also contributing genes at the same time. These were the Denisovans. There was great excitement about this because it looked like precisely the smoking gun which could explain the great leap forward 50,000 years ago, because that was exactly the time that all this swapping of genes was going on. Europeans get between 1 and 4% of their genes from Neanderthals, and they acquired them just before the so-called Great Leap Forward. For a while there was great excitement among anthropologists and archaeologists because it seemed that a long-standing puzzle had been solved. And then everybody suddenly shut up about it and stopped talking about the subject. By tacit consent, there were no more articles in scientific journals and no bits in newspapers proclaiming that an old puzzle had at last been untangled by modern science. What had happened to make this news suddenly so unwelcome? Had a discovery been made that this genetic evidence was unreliable? Had the concept of the Great Leap Forward been abandoned? Well, not at all. What had happened was simply a case of political ideology dictating which kind of scientific discoveries and theories were acceptable and which should be opposed and rejected. Because after testing Europeans, Indians, Arabs and Chinese people and finding the presence of Neanderthal and or Denisovan genes, tests began to be conducted on people from sub-Saharan Africa. It was found that, almost without exception, they lacked any Neanderthal genes at all. The implication was very clear. If Neanderthal genes caused a huge and sudden change in the way that people's brains worked, and the result was a sudden burst of higher thought, abstract and symbolic, then what were the implications for those who had not received those additions to their DNA? Did this mean that there were genuine biological differences between black Africans and Europeans? Could those differences be associated perhaps with intelligence or different kinds of thought? The very idea was unthinkable. The whole of modern politics is founded on the absolute equality of all ethnicities and an utter rejection of any inherent racial differences. Experts in the field soon got the message, and they stopped talking about the whole concept of the Great Leap Forward having a genetic basis, something which had been considered for many years. Objective science had clashed with ideology, and it had been no contest at all. Ideology had won. Genetics had been forced to give way to dogma about race. It was as awful as the days when the Nazis rejected relativity in favour of the mad idea of ice and fire. But there it was. Science had been shown conclusively to be subordinate in the Western world to ideological dogma.